Apaches were very tough people who came down on both sides of the Rocky Mountains about 100 years before the warfare. When the Spanish came in and brought in domestic animals, the Apaches were in heaven. They were able to find horses. They were able to ride quickly into raids, run off with domestic stock, sometimes with people, sometimes with grain, whatever was needed. The Spanish retaliated by making raids themselves and taking Apache women, children, and men, if they could catch them, as slaves and sell them down in the mines in Mexico, where lifespan was about a year. When people from the United States came in, the first thing the Apaches did was offer to help them fight the Mexicans, because the Mexican War was going on at that time. The Americans turned them down.
We broke that treaty, us whites. There's no word in the Apache language for lie, and they've been lied to. And if they rise, there won't be a white left in the territory.
They won't bother me.
In their treaties with Mexico after the Mexican War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States government agreed to keep the Apaches from raiding into Mexico, which would be very similar to trying to stop the wind from blowing across the border. They did not see why the Mexican government had gone ahead and ceded land to the United States, which belonged to the Apaches. As far as the Apaches were concerned, the Mexican government had no right to turn that land over to the United States, because it was Apache land. Nor were we able to stop the Mexicans from coming up in force and killing Apaches in their camps. So the U.S. government was unable to protect the Apaches, and at the same time, they were unable to control the Apaches. As the Civil War took place and the military left the area, the Apaches felt that they had driven the Americans out, and they were very happy about this, but they came back. The Central Apaches were to the west of the Rio Grande, and they comprised mostly the Chiricahua Apaches who are in this movie. These bands would have different names. Victorio's band were the Membrinos, who were living in the Membres Valley near Silver City, New Mexico. Victorio was an extremely fine general. He really knew how to get his people into a battle situation and out of it again with as few people lost as possible. Victorio had developed a really strong belief that the Americans could not be trusted. The Apaches, not having large bands, tended to split the Americans into various groups. There were the blue coat groups who lived in the forts, and there were the rancher groups who raised cattle, and there were the mining groups who dug holes in the ground. These people were not seen as the same people, even though they spoke the same language. So you could be at war with the military and not particularly be at war with the ranchers, or you could have a blood feud with the miners and not have a blood feud with the people who had farms. It was frequent that ranchers would have friendship with individual bands, and those bands would more or less vouch for those ranchers, and the ranchers would be allowed to continue to live in relative peace, while other ranchers or miners would be being shot on the other side of the mountains.
There's trouble brewing in the Apache lodges. Vittorio, their main chief, called a war council. Full report of it's in that dispatch I'm carrying.
But you don't know, we've always gotten along splendidly with the Apache.
Generally, women could not manage on their own without at least one man helping them. On most of the ranches, they had a crew of cowboys or vaqueros, depending on whether they were from Mexico or from the United States. Even a woman alone with a child would have a series of hands who worked for her. It would be very difficult for a woman to live all by herself out in that country without help. That's why you needed to have either a band, as the Apaches did, or you needed to have a ranch complex, which is why Victorio was worried about this woman. He didn't think that she could survive out there by herself, which is probably true. It wouldn't be necessarily that the Apaches would kill her. The country itself was pretty lethal unless you had a lot of help.
You a fool. Your man dead, soon come planting land. If your man come home by then, good. If not, you take Apache breath.
Girl children were more important because they were less expendable than boy children. The women basically owned everything except the men's horses and their saddles and their weapons. The women owned the wickiup. The women made the decisions when the men would go to fight, or when there needed to be a raid, or when they needed to go hunting. The government made the mistake of wanting to talk only to the men, whereas as a matriarchy, the Apaches had to go back and talk to the women before they made very firm decisions. Your mother was the person whose clan you belonged to. Your father's clan was a clan that you were associated with, but you were born into your mother's clan, and therefore had a duty to that particular clan. There were a lot of men who were killed. They lost a lot of children. And because of that, they would raid for more children, more women, in hopes of keeping the numbers of the tribe up. Apaches were much more interested in having children and mothers who were tough than they were in worrying about where they came from. They figured that they could turn them into Apaches pretty quickly. What they wanted were tough kids who would survive.
I learned to make them when I was living with a mescalera.
You lived with the Apache,
5 years.
and you had an Indian wife.
When it came to marriage, for a man to leave a woman is very difficult because he is attached to her family at that point. Whereas for a woman to leave a man, all she has to do is throw his saddle outside. By the time that people from the east came into the Southwest in any number, the Apaches were very firmly set in a terrorist society in which raiding was one way of making a living. A raid was a thing where you wanted to go into someone else's area and take a large amount of stuff that you could use for trade somewhere else. The most successful raids were where you went in, you took what you needed, you left, and no one knew you were there. A war party would be going out to avenge some sort of an insult or someone killing someone else's relatives. Under those circumstances, you went out with no desire to bring anything back. The idea was to kill people and scare everybody else into going away. Apaches preferred to kill people from behind bushes, under rocks, wait for them to come into water holes. There was no display, there was no glory involved. This was guerrilla warfare of the grimmest type. They were indeed as fierce as any group of people that ever lived in their defense of their homeland. The chase scene in Hondo is very entertaining, but it is not an Apache war tactic at all. They would have waited at some narrow spot where the wagons went through, where the Apaches were up in the rocks above the trail, and would have attacked from the sides of the arroyo from the rocks, chasing a wagon. Wore out your horses and might get you hurt. The first federal fort systems were put in prior to the Civil War. The forts were put in strategic locations, generally along roads where people were going to pass so that they could defend travelers. And they were put in places where reservations were going to be. And almost immediately there were disagreements among the military and the Apaches. The military wanted to condense the Apaches in as close an area as possible so that they could control them, whereas the Apaches were used to living over a broad area with not very many people close together. When you concentrate people like that, you end up with a lot more sickness. You end up with a lot more people who are going to get mad at other people. you have a lot more friction. The military and the government in Washington tended to lump the Apaches together as Apaches, whereas the Apaches were not a cohesive group. And if you made treaties with one group, that did not mean that you had made treaties with other groups. And no thought was taken to how these people were going to live, how they were going to make a living. Money was not set aside by Congress. These people had to eat. They would go from being in very good condition with plenty of horses, plenty of things to eat, to actual starvation because no food was being prepared for them, and they were not allowed to go out and hunt off the reservation. They were not allowed to raid, and no one was bringing in cattle to them to eat. So people would go into the winter with virtually no food. The Apaches did not understand why the Americans would make agreements which they would very solemnly sign and then completely ignore the fact that people were starving to death. They were simply told that they would have to live there, and if they objected, they had the choice of trying to run to Mexico and escape, or simply being chased until they died. Victorio did finally come into the reservations and tried to settle down, and he realized that if he were ever arrested, he would never get out of jail alive. At that point, he decided that he would leave the reservation and make a run for his old home. In the movie, he is killed in a charge against the patrol of American soldiers, a thing that Victorio would never have done. Victorio would not have charged into a group of soldiers under any circumstance. He was really killed in Mexico by the Mexican army, basically with a large number of Tarahumara Indians who had tracked him down and figured out where he would be. Victorio's sister Lawson went both on raids and war parties with her brother. She was considered to be a very famous person with a great deal of what was called war medicine. She knew where the enemy was and what they were doing. Victorio actually got killed at the end because Lawson wasn't with him. The Mescaleros, the Western Apaches, were left on the reservations. The Chiricahuas were rounded up en masse and shipped to Florida. Every one of them, including the Chiricahuas and the Apache scouts who had been assisting the army during the whole thing. The fact that you had been a person who had worked in the military, the American side, did not even count. They were all shipped to Florida, where a large number of them died. They were then shipped to Arkansas, where a number more died, and eventually had a choice between going to Fort Sill in Oklahoma or back to the Mescalero Reservation in New Mexico. Geronimo stayed in Fort Sill. The Chiricahuas were treated much more harshly than most of the other Indians in the Southwest. The Spanish arrived. They settled in a large amount of the Southwest that was